My biggest regret from part 1 was not wearing the hat the whole video. So here we are. I also want to give a slight warning that in this video I am talking about disappearances and murder, so it is not going to be as fun and lighthearted as part 1. I've already made a video going over really strange disappearances in national parks, so I encourage you to check that out if you also want a little bit of a preface on national parks and disappearances, but I will be going over more details in this video. When speaking about national parks disappearances, I think it's important to recognize a few things at once. First being that I fully recognize that these parks are large and vast, and when somebody does go missing, it is extremely hard to find them. This can be true while also recognizing that some disappearances are really strange and kind of fishy or may involve foul play. I brought this up in my last video, but national parks, which are overseen by the Department of Interior, aren't really good at keeping track of disappearances and have been really weird, defensive, and cagey in the past when that has been brought up. In part 1, I said this: Yosemite does have the most disappearances of national parks, and originally I was like, maybe that's because it's the biggest, because it's fucking huge. But when I googled it, the top 8 parks are all in the millions of acres. And someone pointed out in my comments that in 2019, Yosemite was the 5th most visited park and the Grand Canyon was the 2nd, I believe. So yes, while many Alaskan national parks are bigger and have a lot less disappearances, they also have a lot less visitors. So I think that is something definitely worth mentioning, and I want to thank that commenter for pointing that out. So now I do want to back up my claim that Yosemite has the most disappearances with the most concrete evidence that we have, which isn't a lot. So instead of using like Missing 411, which people love to poke holes in, I'm gonna go off of the National Parks website. The National Park Service does have a page with 26 missing persons cases, 1 unsolved homicide, and 1 missing persons case with suspicious circumstances. Of those 28, 10 are from Yosemite, 5 are from the Grand Canyon, and 4 are from the Smoky Mountains. The other 9 are spread out across 7 other parks. So that's kind of the best evidence I can give. In my first National Parks video, I also talk about Stacy Ann Aris, who is possibly the most famous missing person case from Yosemite. So quick recap. Stacy was on a horseback riding trip when she went down to the lake in full view of everybody on the trip. Then she went behind a few trees to take some better pictures. When she didn't come back out only a few minutes later, everyone went looking for her. Nothing was ever found other than a camera lens from her camera just on the ground. Journalist Brent Swanser filed a Freedom of Information Act to get a copy of the case and was denied, followed by a really sketchy phone call in which the operator, National Park worker, Department of Interior worker, I don't remember the exact details, was just super cagey and sketchy in the way they talked about Stacy's case. And then we find out later that Stacy's own family tried to get their hands on her case and were also denied. So when I say they're being weird or cagey about certain cases, I mean it. July 9th, 1995, Jeanne Hesselschwerd and her boyfriend Mike were driving to Yosemite National Park. On Glacier Road, they pulled over and decided to take short walks separately and meet back at the car. 15 minutes later, Mike returned to the car as they agreed, but Jeanne didn't. Mike was asking various tourists and other hikers if they had seen her, but nobody had. Then he went back and forth between waiting for her at the car and searching for her before driving down to get park rangers. They started the search within 45 minutes. 2 hours later, helicopters showed up, and the next day they brought out the dogs. The sniffer dogs went down the trail, then circled back to the car, leading many of the dog handlers to believe that Mike might have been involved and there was possibly foul play. Later, the family contacted the FBI, who gave Mike a polygraph test, and everything came back negative. I know polygraph tests don't always hold up, or they're not always real, or they're really easy to fake, or whatever, but I truly don't believe Mike was involved, and I don't want to see any Mike slander in the comments. A large-scale search was launched with the grid pattern method, firefighters, hundreds of volunteers, but eventually it was called off 2 weeks later, which is pretty standard for most of the cases I've read. But here's where things get shaken up a little bit. A friend of Jeanne's roommate called a prominent tracking school for help after the official search had wrapped up. The article I read went into a lot of detail about how all the tracking works, and it is really cool, but unfortunately I am already scared at how long this video is going to be, so I'm just gonna go over the basics of what they found. The tracker noticed there were a lot of aspen trees in the area, and when wind blows through aspen trees, it mimics the sound of a car on a road. So if someone got turned around and were looking for a way back and followed the sound, assuming it was the road, they would have actually headed in the opposite direction of the road. From there, they were able to make some guesses and do some fancy tracker shit. The trackers explain that once somebody gets lost, they immediately go into shock and begin to panic and may make some irrational decisions. And between that and talking with Janie's friend and getting more details about her as a person, they were able to surmise the direction that she would have went. Once she got to a certain point, she would have been able to look out and see the lights of the Yosemite Valley, and probably being a determined, independent person, would have decided she was gonna get to those fucking lights, which I think is not a bad way to go if you are lost. Follow the lights back to civilization. However, that would have had her going down really rough terrain and would have brought her to a creek that at the time was full of water from snow shed in the mountain. The rocks in the creek would be super smooth and slippery from the rushing water, so no matter where Jeanne tried to cross, it would have been really dangerous. So the tracker guessed that she probably attempted to cross, slipped, hit her head, and drowned unconscious. The tracker notified the authorities of what they found and where her body likely was. Because this was done entirely from a desk and the student didn't actually go to the trail, the police weren't buying it. But the tracker said he and his friend were personally going to go find the body next weekend. So suck it, police. He didn't say suck it, but I'm saying suck it. So on September 3rd, 1995, 2 months after Jeanne went missing, the tracker and his friend found Jeanne's body about a quarter mile away from where they had estimated. Now here's the shitty thing. The police don't think her body could have been carried by the rushing water because it was so full of debris, and that the tracker finding her was just dumb luck. Which is just a dick move. Like, just admit that somebody else was right and you didn't take them seriously. Dear police, just admit when you're wrong. It would take you so far. It would take you so far. I see a lot of people trying to implicate Mike. I really don't think it's Mike, and I wrote out this whole part of my script as to why I didn't think it was Mike. But instead, I'll just say that both the tracker and the police said that the area was extremely inaccessible unless you were an experienced hiker or climber, and Mike was neither. The tracker talked about when people get lost, they go into shock, they begin to panic, they make decisions they wouldn't usually make. And something else I think in the future I will definitely remember when it comes to talking about missing people and disappearances. Before I move on to the murder section of this video, I would like to read off the names of the remaining missing people from Yosemite that I didn't get to go over in this video, because they deserve to be remembered just as much as those who have been found. Peter Jackson, 2016. George Penka, 2011. Michael Fickery, or Fissery, 2005. Walter H. Reinhardt, 2002. Ruth Ann Rupert, 2000. Kieran Burke, 2000. David Paul Morrison, 1998. Timothy Barnes, 1988. And lastly, Dikran Natajan, 1972. BTW, they picked the worst Xerox photo of him for their website, so I did give him a better one. Okay, so let's move on to the heaviest part of this video, the murders. I'm going to start off the murder section of this video first by reading the names of the victims, because I want to keep things very victims first on this channel. 42-year-old Carol Sund, 15-year-old Julie Sund, 16-year-old Silviana Palazzo, and 26-year-old Joey Ruth Armstrong. On February 12, 1999, Carol, her daughter Julie, and their foreign exchange student and family friend Silvina left for a big, fun road trip. Basically, the plan was to fly to SF, rent a car, drive to Stockton, then to the Yosemite area, and in 2 days, they would meet up with Jen's son so they could all fly to Arizona. The trip went as planned, and they made it to the Cedar Lodge in El Portal on February 14th, which is very near to Yosemite on the western slopes. On February 15th, the ladies hiked into Yosemite during the day, and then that evening when they got back, they rented some movies from the lodge to watch back in their room, and that was the last time they were seen alive. Interestingly, they checked out ahead of time. So when the maids came in to clean the next morning, everything seemed fine and the hotel keys were left on the desk. The next morning, Carol Sun's husband, Jens, went to the San Francisco airport where he was supposed to meet up with the girls, but they never showed, so he assumed they had just flown out ahead of him. When he attempted to make contact with them the next day on the 17th, he couldn't get in touch and called the police. Police and Yosemite park rangers began to search. They assumed, like most disappearances, they had just gone off trail and were lost or injured. Police, family, and volunteers searched the area while park rangers searched by helicopter for 4 weeks. During this search, they were also looking for the red Pontiac the women had rented because the rental service confirmed that the car was never returned, meaning the women never made it out of Yosemite. Then Carol Sun's wallet was found in Modesto, and Modesto is 2 hours away from Yosemite, and this was the first sign that this was more than a disappearance. On March 12, 1999, FBI agent James Maddock told press, "We feel most certain that the women were victims of a violent crime." At this time, FBI set up headquarters in Modesto because this was officially a murder case. It was also at this time that Jen's son offered a $250,000 reward for any information that would lead to their safe return, and after a few weeks that was upped to $300,000. On March 19th, over a month since they had last been seen, hikers stumbled upon the burned Pontiac on a logging road on the northeastern edge of the park about 100 miles away from the lodge where they stayed. In the trunk of the Pontiac, they found the charred bodies of Carol Sun and Silvina Palazzo, who were ID'd through dental records. A week later, on March 25th, the FBI would receive an anonymous tip that led them to the badly decomposed body of Julie Sund. She was found at the Don Pedro Reserves, several miles away from where the previous bodies had been found. Over the next month, they interviewed a large amount of sex offenders and others who had been convicted of violent crimes and narrowed in on 2 specific suspects, neither of whom's names or backgrounds I'm going to go over because, spoiler alert, it wasn't them. In July of that year, Joey Ruth Armstrong, a naturalist at the Yosemite Institute, was leaving for a weekend trip to visit some friends. But when she didn't show, they became worried and called park rangers. When they went to her cabin, they found her white truck all packed up for the weekend, but no Joey. A search party of Yosemite employees and rangers showed up and began to search the immediate area for her. After only a few minutes, they spot footprints, trampled grass, and other signs that suggest somebody had run through that area. Thanks to her keyring, which was reflecting off the sun, they found Joey's body, which was in really bad shape. This made park rangers really nervous, as it had only been a few months since the last murders, and even though those criminals were supposedly behind bars and this was a much messier crime than the one before, they were worried they were connected. However, right away, authorities received a tip that a white 1979 International Scout had been parked near Armstrong's cabin the day she went missing. On July 22nd, the rangers spotted that same car at the Cedar Lodge where Julie, Carol, and Silvina had stayed. There, they happened upon the very naked Carrie Stainer smoking a joint laying out in the sun. Murderers don't deserve weed. 2022. I don't make the rules. Stainer had actually been questioned in February regarding the disappearances of the previous 3 women because he was a handyman at the Cedar Lodge where they were staying, and that's just kind of routine. However, this time they were able to detain him because of the joint, but they ended up just confiscating the weed and letting him go, with the warning that he shouldn't leave the area. Later, the FBI matched his tire tread with the tread at Joey's cabin, but by the time they went to get him, he was gone. When they found him, he was near Sacramento, so they drove him into Sacramento, booked him, and questioned him again. This time, he confessed to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Silvina. Now, here's the thing about Stainer, and the only reason I've said his name so many times, even though he's a massive piece of shit. In December of 1972, Stainer's then 7-year-old brother, Stephen, was kidnapped while walking home from school on the Yosemite highway. His brother wasn't found till 7 years later on March 2nd, 1980. Stephen escaped his abductor, a convicted pedophile and Yosemite Lodge employee. Doesn't that sound familiar? Where does that sound familiar? Stainer had actually been questioned in February because he was a handyman at the Cedar Lodge where they were staying. This is just a side note, but I saw several reports of people being like, Stephen just never got it together after that. And Carey himself said his head was all bloated out because of media attention. Like, did no one think that being held captive by a sexual predator from ages 7 to 15 might permanently fuck up Stephen? Like, we don't have to go into explicit detail, but I think we can all understand that sexual predators don't abduct children and just keep them in their basements to play video games. And like, every murderer is selfish, but Carey has to be a special kind of asshole to be like, his brother was so full of himself because after being kidnapped for 7 years, he was just such an attention whore. Like, what a piece of shit. Anyway, Carey Stainer was rightfully convicted of the murders and remains on death row in San Quentin to this day. Before we move on, I want to add, Stainer's family vacationed in Yosemite for years. And in his teens, Carey was a very accomplished outdoorsman and was very familiar with the area. On top of that, he says his murderous feelings started when he was really young. On the last Adventurers blog post about the deer heads, Michael commented, "Look up Carey Stainer and the crime he committed the very next summer, very close to where you found the deer heads. I'm sure you've heard about this by now. Perhaps your instincts were right. Scary for sure." Coupled with the previous information I just talked about, I think Michael is really onto something here. Often, killers do start by killing animals. So perhaps for a time, Carey was like, I'm not gonna murder women, and I'm just gonna be super creepy with these deer heads. It's just a theory, but it's a really interesting one, and one that I personally kind of believe. I want to end on somewhat of a high note, even though it does still involve murder, and perhaps an even bigger piece of shit human being. The cold case of a homicide Jane Doe from Yosemite in the early 80s. Her partial remains were found in 1983 on Yosemite National Park's Summit Meadow along Glacier Point Road. Despite not having her jawbone, they were able to make a composite photo of her face and estimated that she was between her teens and 30s. The main suspect in this case is such a big piece of shit attention whore that I will not be saying his name in this video, but will briefly flash it on screen just so you know who I'm talking about. This POS was interviewed in the 80s where he gave information about this murder that was not publicly known and would have only been known by the murderer. We don't know what that information was, but he did state she was a hitchhiker that he picked up on Highway 41 between Fresno and Yosemite. Said piece of shit died in prison in 2004, and good riddance. Many agencies worked tirelessly for many years to get her identified, but were unable to. Until fall of 2020, when ISB worked with Marshall University and Paraben Nano Labs to genotype her DNA, which gave them so much more information, but I'll leave an article linked in the description if you want a little more detail. But through this, they were able to make a much more detailed composite sketch photo and were able to identify possible relatives. They ended up finding her family and were able to give them closure after she went missing over 30 years ago. At the request of her family, her identity has not been shared, but honestly, who cares? It is amazing that we have the technology today to solve cases from over 30 years ago and give families closure. To end this video, I want to read a quote from an Outside article by Joshua Hammer. Not only do such crimes violate our sense of an idyllic setting, but they represent everyone's worst wilderness nightmares come true. The unseen predator who creeps out of the darkness and then disappears back into the shadows of the forest without a trace. Everybody take a deep breath. How's everybody feeling? That was some heavy shit. but it was interesting. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. We are almost at 100 subscribers, which is just insane to me. Obviously, this is such a small number, especially on YouTube, but it really does mean a lot to me. I was thinking maybe we should celebrate 100 subscribers with a special video. I'm thinking something like a drunk cryptid tier list. So please let me know what you think about that in the comments. Like, would you even be interested in that? I'll probably also bring it up on my Instagram. Speaking of Instagram, if you want updates on videos, Instagram is the best place to get them. I also ask for feedback on Instagram. I have you vote on various things like thumbnails and video topics, so it's just a great place to interact. It's also a great place to tell me about video topics, but you can also leave video topics in the comments and I'll always see them there. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hate to say it, but please like and subscribe. It really does help so much with even just the motivation to make videos. So yeah, I'm Clever Haunts, and I guess that's it.